Learning to work with the align and distribute options is important, but there's also another very important aspect of Illustrator to be able to work very precisely, and that is to learn to work with guides. I already mentioned before that when you move objects around, you probably notice these purple lines appearing. They are actually called smart guides, and they can help you also to align objects to each other. Mainly, the center point is what's going to come up as an alignment guide. So when I align the center points together, it tells me that they are now perfectly aligned to their center point. So even if the objects are different in size, it will still work. When I get to the center point of the other shape, it will tell me that it's now aligned. Now, if I drag this other object here, it will also help me to align them to each other, but it also shows me when the distance between these objects is the same. So it almost works as a distribute spacing technique, once again just relying simply on the smart guides. Of course, smart guides will also show up when you try to align to the edge of an object, or here to the other object, and of course it will work once again once we move this shape here closer. But you don't have to rely on smart guides because you can create your own guides as well. One way to add guides is to drag them out from rulers. So you can drag out a horizontal guide from the top ruler or a vertical guide from the left ruler. If you drag a guide from the top and you want to switch the direction of it, just hold down the Alt key. That way it can be turned into a vertical guide. By default, these guides are locked, but you can always go into the view menu and under guides, you can unlock them. Once they are unlocked, that means you can easily position them and move them around. But also a useful thing that once you can select a guide, I can set the X and Y value for them. In case of a horizontal guide, it's more important to set the Y value. If I just type in 25, it will go exactly there. So from the top edge of this artboard, it goes down 25 millimeters. For this guide here on the left, let's say I want this to be also 25 millimeters, but on the X value, which means from left, it will be 25 millimeters. As you can see, that's exactly the same distance from the top left corner. So now if I want, I can move these objects around and I can not only align them to each other, but I can also align them to these guides. So that's a great technique, again, if you want to work very precisely. And another interesting thing is that you can actually turn objects into guides. So let's just say I duplicate this object and I'm going to keep it selected, and then I go to the view menu. And there I can find under the guides an option called Make Guides. That's Command or Control 5, by the way. And if I select that, then the whole object is now turned into a guide. So once again, if I move shapes around it, now I can align everything to this guide, this square guide basically. But what's important about guides is that they are never going to be printed. So once you print this design out, these guides are not going to be visible. And you can also hide them if you don't wish to see them. So there's a shortcut for that as well. The semicolon and Command or Control can hide them or show them again. If you decide not to use guides anymore, or the current guides you want to get rid of, you can also clear the guides. Also, if you feel like the smart guides always get in the way, you can turn them off. Once again, View, and just simply turn them off here. Command or Control U is the shortcut to turn them off. Once smart guides are off, you won't be able to see those purple lines appearing anymore. Apart from guides and smart guides, there is another great feature that you can use to work precisely, and that's called Grid. Once again, that's under the View menu, and you can turn it on, Show Grid, which then can be used to align the objects to. But to activate it, you also have to turn on the Snap to Grid option. Once that's on, now if you move objects around, you will see how they will be aligned to the grid. So that is also an extremely useful technique, and it also helps to very quickly align objects and keep the space between them exactly the same. Like now we have one block between them, and that was very easy. But if I want to have 2 squares distance between them, I can also do that just as quickly. Not only moving the objects will be aligned to the grid, but also resizing these objects. So when the grid is active and snap to grid is on, you will be able to very quickly resize shapes and align them to the grid. And you can see how quickly I managed to make these shapes exactly the same size. Now, to change the grid itself, you can go to the preferences and choose guides and grid, where you will be able to set exactly how many divisions you want. So you can set up the grid lines to be every 25 millimeters, or you can set it to, let's say, 10. And even within that, you can set up the subdivisions. So now that I made it finer, if I click OK, we will have much more blocks available. And obviously that allows a much more precise way of working with these shapes as well, because they will be still snapping to the grid, but it's a much finer grid than before. It's also good to know that you can change the measurement or units of your rulers by right-clicking on them. So there you can find inches, for example, and it changes both rulers, of course, at the same time. But what you can also change is whether you want the rulers to be connected to the artboard or to be global. That's what you can see here. Change to artboard rulers or change to global rulers. Now let me turn off the grid. So I will choose hide to grid. And by the way, even though you turn off the grid, it's still going to snap to the grid. So you have to also remember to turn off the snap to grid option if you don't want to be restricted by the grid anymore. But what I would like to do here is to use the artboard tool and create an additional artboard. So I have my first artboard and I'm going to have my second one next to it. So now that we have 2 artboards, let's see what happens to the rulers. When I have this left artboard selected, the 0 point both on the vertical and horizontal rulers is set to the top left corner. When I click on the other artboard, it will update, so the 0 point now is on the top left corner of this second artboard. Why is that important? Because if I select an object and it's on this second artboard here, I can set its position from the transform panel to 0, and that will keep it on the same artboard. Remember, if I set the reference point to be on the top left corner and then I set both values to 0, 0, that means it's moved on to the top left corner within this artboard. But if I go back to the ruler and I choose global rulers, then when I choose 0 and 0, that will actually be always the first artboard's origin point. But of course, remember, the origin point or center of the coordinate system can be added anywhere. So if I choose this point here to be the center point, then whenever I type in 0 and 0, now it's going to be aligned to that point. To reset the center point, you just have to double click on this intersection here on the top, the intersection of the rulers. And don't forget, you can always switch between artboard rulers or global rulers. I actually prefer to work with artboard rulers, so each artboard will have its own coordinate system essentially. And that is all I wanted to show you in this video. So now not only alignment and distribution can help us, but also guides, grids, and rulers to precisely position our objects. And this is all I wanted to explain in this chapter. But to practice the most important things that we've learned here, in the next video, I'm going to give you a couple of exercises that you can go through to make sure you understand the most important concepts.